On the 22nd of January 1879 in South Africa, the British suffered probably the worst ever defeat inflicted upon them by a native African army, when a force of 1,500 was annihilated by the Zulus. And then that night, and through into the early hours of the following day, a small British garrison of 100 men held off a Zulu force 40 times their size in one of the most gallant defences ever conducted by the British Army. This is the story of the battles of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. I've always been fascinated by the Zulu Wars, ever since I was about 4 years old. My parents emigrated from England to Durban about a year beforehand, and sometime around my 4th birthday, my dad took me to the two battlefields. I think it was more for his interest than as some sort of educational a trip for his son. Now, funny enough, I don't remember a lot about Rorke's Drift apart from the red corrugated iron roof on the mission station. But I do have quite vivid memories of Isandlwana. And I remember walking up onto the slopes of the mountain. And also, I really do recall this quite slightly eerie feeling. Rather like, I've also had that at the Battle of Culloden, at the battlefield of Culloden. And I actually got a souvenir from the battlefields. Here we go. My dad picked this up. It's possibly a spoke from a wagon. Someone else said it might be a coffee grinder. And of course it just might be some old, farmyard tat that's been thrown on the battlefield. I just want to point out though, this was picked up in the days before when you still could lift artefacts off battlefield monuments. Okay, so I want to share you the story of these two battles with you. South Africa in 1879 was divided between two British colonies of the Cape and along the coast Natal, where Durban is now. And inland there were two Boer Dutch republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The British High Commissioner, Sir Bartle Frere, had a goal of creating a single British-controlled confederation of South Africa, bringing together those 4 white-controlled areas into one dominion, rather like it just happened in Canada. And this was seen as a great way to grow the empire. And indeed, he'd actually just taken over those two Boer republics because they were bankrupt. There was, however, one fly in the ointment: the independent and military powerful kingdom of the Zulus. The Zulus have been set up, or the Zulu kingdom had come together under the military genius 𝐓𝐡𝐞 in the 1820s. It was a militaristic society where all the men had to serve in the army at some stage, and I suppose that was almost the structure of the society. Having just recently annexed the Boer republics, they wanted to really show the Dutch in those former republics just what Britain had to offer, in particular security. And they wanted at the same time to remove this military obstacle that were the Zulus. However, the British government were not keen on any sort of war. It was costly, and they're already bogged down in a war in Afghanistan. Yes, we were there then in 1879. And actually the British have been on peaceful terms with the Zulus, really ever since Shaka's days. And the Zulu king, 𝐁𝐀 was their preferred candidate in a war of succession that only happened less than 10 years previously. So this presented Frere with a problem. The British government were going to give him no additional troops. And fundamentally, if he wanted a war with the Zulus and take them out so he could form his confederation, he was going to have to do it on the sly, without the British government knowing about it. The good news was that communications from Cape Town to London took about 20 days. The telegraph only went from basic Britain to the island of Madeira in the Atlantic, and from there they had to rely on a steamship. So, if he could conduct a lightning campaign, he would present the British government with a fait accompli, and he'd present Queen Victoria with a new addition to her empire. And what's there not to like about that? Of course, the downside of this fast and loose strategy was they couldn't ask the government in London for any additional troops. So the British commander in Southern Africa, Lord Chelmsford, would have to rely on his existing British troops in Natal, which were the principally the 1st and the 2nd Battalions of the 24th Foot, red-coated soldiers, along with some local colonial troops raised, who could ride and shoot. Over half his force would have to consist of local Africans who were formed into what was called the Natal Native Contingent. And they were only armed with spears and their shields, so they looked just like Zulus, except they wore a red bandana around their head. So with that decided, the 2 battalions, some colonial troops, some the Natal Native Corps, Frere engineered a war. He sent an ultimatum to the Zulus' king with a series of, quite frankly, totally unacceptable demands, deliberately unacceptable demands. In particular, that he disbanded his army, which was the whole way that the Zulu kingdom was structured. And without the army, there'd probably be anarchy. Certainly the king's authority would be destroyed. And arguably the Zulu nation would be destroyed and sure as heck open to invasion by the British or colonists. So, not surprisingly, the Zulus refused. And so in January 1879, the British invaded. So let's just make this absolutely clear. This was a totally unprovoked attack. Although I guess you could argue, with such a militaristic society as the Zulus, living alongside them, could you really have had a peaceful settlement in South Africa in the long term? Don't know. Chelmsford divided his invasion force into 3 columns, each entering Zululand from a different direction, but all moving towards the capital at Ulundi. And a 4th column was held in reserve to protect Natal from a possible Zulu counterattack. The main column was number 3 column, and that was going to be commanded by Chelmsford himself. The number 3 column consisted of over 4,000 men. Regular British soldiers from the 24th Foot of Regiment of Foot, the white colonial soldiers, and about 2,300 Natal Native contingent. 𝐁𝐀 mustered his forces at Ulundi and sent them out to face all 3 columns, but his biggest force he sent against number 3 column, where the British commander was. Number 3 column crossed the Buffalo River into Zululand at a place called Rorke. Rorke had started life as a sort of trading post and then had become a missionary station, and now Chelmsford had commandeered it and he turned it into a supply depot and a hospital. They advanced into Zululand, and on the 21st of January 1879 they set up camp underneath a mountain called Isandlwana. Chelmsford sent a large reconnaissance force eastwards towards the Zulu capital, trying to spot the Zulu army coming towards him, the Zulu 𝐓𝐴𝐴 as it was called. And that force, that reconnaissance force, consisted of 1,600 Natal Native contingent with a few colonials, and it was commanded by Major John Dartnell. Dartnell had gone about 14 miles east of Isandlwana when he encountered a sizable Zulu force. In fact, the Zulu force tried to encircle him at one stage. And with darkness descending, Dartnell couldn't easily go back over the 14 miles with this many Zulus going all around him, so he had to spend a very jittery night in a defensive position. And to his east, he was looking out, and on the hills he could see hundreds of small campfires lit by the watching Zulus. When Chelmsford heard the news, he decided that Dartnell had met the advance guard of the main Zulu army. And it was his keen desire to smash the Zulus as fast as possible. He decided to march out without delay. So at 3:30 in the morning, still in the pitch black, he moved out with 1,100 of his men and most of his artillery. He left 1,700 men in the camp under Colonel Pauline, with orders to strike the camp later in the day and follow him, bringing as much ammunition as possible for the fight that was about to happen, was about to take place. He also ordered the 4th column under Colonel Anthony Durnford, which was at Rorke's Drift, protecting Natal, to come forward and join Pauline at Isandlwana. Fatally, Chelmsford had split his army in enemy territory when he didn't really know where the Zulus were. The reconnaissance force were telling him there were some Zulus to the east, but they didn't know how many. and they didn't know if that was the vanguard of the Zulu army or not. It never occurred to Chelmsford that the camp could be attacked by the Zulus. His biggest concern, actually, was that the Zulus wouldn't meet him in battle at all, and they would adopt a guerrilla hit-and-run style tactics, which he just couldn't win, and would also, of course, start to close down his time window before the government in London found out what he was up to. So, as I say, he raced off to the east to deliver a crushing blow on the Zulus. But Chelmsford had made a fatal error. Not only had he divided his force, but the forces that had been seen by Dartnell were a decoy. The Zulus had brilliantly managed to move 25,000 men over the hills unobserved, and were now lying silently in a valley a few miles north of the camp of Isandlwana. And Chelmsford was going out over there. Wednesday the 22nd of January dawned. Pauline was a solid administrator, a great guy for running a camp, sorting things out, but he'd never actually been in action before. So he must have been mighty relieved when Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Durnford and his 4th column cantered into the camp from Rorke's Drift. And just at that moment, reports started to come in from scouts in the camp who'd been up on the hills behind the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐀𝐧𝐥𝐿, saying they'd seen Zulus. And indeed there were. Because up there was the 70-year-old Zulu commander who had run 70 miles from Ulundi with his men. And it was him and his escort having a look at the camp, getting their battle plans ready. Believing that the Zulus were trying to encircle Chelmsford, coming round here, Chelmsford was over there, they were going to come round behind, Durnford immediately decided to ride east towards Chelmsford to cut off the Zulu advance. It was at 11:30 that morning that Lieutenant Rorke, leading a group of scouts on the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐀𝐧𝐥𝐿, came to a ridge, peered over, and was filled with horror. What he saw, silently sitting there, were over 20,000 Zulus. His men let off a volley, pretty useless against 20,000 Zulus, and the Zulu army rose. They realised they'd been found, and almost to a man, their battle plans started. In fact, the senior commanders had to run to catch up with their troops, and the Zulu army started to pour out of this ravine and form the famous charging bull buffalo formation of the Zulus that Rorke had perfected, where the army comes out, splits like this, like the horns of a buffalo. They come round. The main body is here. The horns lock at the back, and then the body comes in for the kill. The right horn started to move across the northern heights to the north of the camp. They were engaged by British troops who were up there, but they just kept moving, and they moved over and off to the side of the mountain. Meanwhile, the left horn came off and was coming across the plain when they ran straight in to Anthony Durnford and his men. Durnford started a fighting retreat back towards the camp, trying to slow the advance of the Zulu left horn. Pauline formed his men, his British regular soldiers and the NNC, along the north and northeast of the camp, facing the hills and the oncoming Zulus. You've got to remember that it was principally the 1st Battalion who were in the camp of Isandlwana who'd been left there, and these men were veterans. Their average age was 32. They had been soldiering, most of them, for at least 12 years. They'd been in countless colonial campaigns. They were experienced soldiers. And as the 15,000 Zulu, the main chest, descended off the heights, they waited. The fight started, and they pinned the Zulus down. Zulus after Zulus were just being mowed down by this accurate, regular British fire. Chelmsford was alerted by cannon fire. Something was happening at the camp, so he asked a naval officer to climb up on a nearby hill and look at the camp through his telescope. And he came back and he reported that all he could see were the tents were all still up, which is a good sign because you're supposed to knock all your tents down if there's a battle so that you can have a clean field of fire. But all the tents seemed to be still up, and the cattle were being herded into the camp, which looked like they were getting ready to maybe break camp and start to move all the ammunition and everything up to Chelmsford. So it all looked under control. But the cattle weren't being herded by the British. The cattle were fleeing the oncoming left horn of the Zulu army. Chelmsford was having lunch when a breathless rider arrived from Isandlwana with a message from Pauline requesting urgent assistance. Out on the plain, Durnford was running low on ammunition and sent men back to try and get some more from the camp. And at that stage, 2 companies of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment of Foot, under Lieutenants Pope and a man called Godwin Austin, moved off their line to try and get closer to Durnford to give him some covering fire. Unfortunately, at that moment, Durnford, because they weren't liaising, withdrew, leaving them horribly exposed. His men were on horses, and they withdrew. And now suddenly Pope and Godwin Austin's companies were left out in effectively no man's land, with the Zulu left horn coming towards them. They were annihilated. The Natal native contingent, remember these were natives, some were Zulu refugees, fugitives, others had lived under Zulu rule in the past. They certainly knew the Zulus from just across the river. And there they were, armed with spears. They'd just seen 2 companies of redcoats wiped out. And all they had was spears to fight their Zulus with. They fled. And as they fled back through the camp, they came through the camp, and some of the civilians panicked as well who were in the camp. They started to flee with them. They came over the back of the hill. And as they did so, they met the right wing, the right horn of the Zulu army. That one that had been up on the north, and they'd been firing at them, and then they disappeared behind the mountain. Well, now they'd come round the mountain. They were closing the famous horns of the charging buffalo. And they started to come over the hill and into the unarmed camp, because all the soldiers were out on the other side fighting the main body of the Zulus. Pauline looked around him. He ordered the bugler to recall the men to camp. And as they got up and started to run to camp, the main Zulu chest out there on the northeast of the camp, rose, 15,000 of them, and charged. It became fast turning into a rout as they ran back into the camp. Small groups of soldiers standing back to back, using their last bullets, then their bayonets, then even some of them their fists, Zulus talked about afterwards. The camp was disintegrating. Pauline gave the regimental and the Queen's colours to a man called Lieutenant Melville and told him to take the colours, the symbols of the regiment, to safety. They must not be captured by the Zulus. And he rode off and was joined by a man called Lieutenant Coghill, and they galloped out of the camp. And there's some heroic paintings from Victorian times of this attempting to save the colours. And as the battle reached its zenith, this hellish scene became more hellish as the sun actually entered a partial eclipse, and this weird darkness descended on Isandlwana with all the gunpowder and all the smoke and the mayhem. And meanwhile, above the mayhem in the camp, C Company, the last company out on the end of the line, managed to retreat along the slopes of Isandlwana above the camp, firing down on the Zulus. Eventually that Zulu right wing was there blocking them, their retreat. They couldn't go any further. And when their ammunition ran out, Younghusband, their commander, Lieutenant Younghusband, led his men in a brave but futile bayonet charge down the slopes into the Zulu army. Terrified survivors couldn't go back down the road to Rorke's Drift because the Zulu right wing the right horn were coming up it because they'd come round the mountain. The only thing they could do was flee across country down a trail towards the Buffalo River, down a trail which is now called Fugitives Trail. Through thorn bushes, boggy ground, Zulus chasing them, Zulus in light foot, men in steel-shod boots, heavy clothing, running in the temperature that day was something like 40 degrees centigrade. And the Zulus were on home turf. And they were running in and out, stabbing these fugitives as they went down towards the Buffalo River. Amongst the fugitives were Lieutenants Coghill and Melville with the Queen's colours, riding to safety. When the fugitives reached the river, they found it in full flood, and they had now had the Zulus behind them, a flooded river in front of them. Not a single man who wasn't on horseback escaped Isandlwana. As I say, the trail is called Fugitives Trail, and the river crossing is Fugitives Drift. And it was there on the far bank, having ridden their horses through the flooded river, that Melville and Coghill were overtaken by Zulus who had come across the river, and they were killed. The colour floated off down the river. The battle was all over by 2:30, in less than 3 hours since Rorke had discovered the Zulus in their ravine. The British army of 1,500 had been destroyed. As I say, not a single man on foot escaped with their lives. More alarming reports were coming into Chelmsford by now, not least from an officer called Lonsdale. Lonsdale had been with Chelmsford's party, but he'd been sent back to Isandlwana because he'd suffered a fall and was also suffering from the effects of heat stroke, so he was told back to go back to the base camp. And there he was, riding along in pain, heat stroke, sort of in a daze. He was almost letting his horse do the work and sort of letting his horse be on homing device back towards Isandlwana. And his horse wandered into the camp. And Lonsdale sort of came to and he focused, and he suddenly became aware that there were Zulus milling all around him, including one wearing a red tunic who came out of a tent and took a shot at him. He turned his horse and spurred into a gallop. Some of the Zulus tried to give chase, but, you know, they were half-hearted. They were absolutely exhausted after that battle. They'd run 70 miles from Ulundi, and now they'd just fought a 3-hour battle. His news, when he got back to the Chelmsford's camp, absolutely shocked Chelmsford. He turned his force round and he retraced his steps from the morning. It was nightfall before Chelmsford re-entered the camp. Bodies lay everywhere. Many of the British soldiers had been ritually disemboweled by the Zulus, not, as Victorians would claim later, as some sort of torture. But actually the Zulus had a belief that a dead warrior's spirit needed to be released, or else their stomach would fill, as it would with gases, and the spirit couldn't get out, and the spirit would haunt the man who'd killed him. So if you'd killed a spirit, you cut him open. But that gory sight was what Chelmsford came to. Thank goodness it was dark, and his men were told to just sleep where they were. And some of the men woke up and found they'd been sleeping next to dead bodies and with gore, and they'd been sleeping in that stuff. I mean, what a hellish nightmare night they must have had, constantly fearing that they might have another Zulu attack. But the Zulus were exhausted. They'd gone. Of the camp that he had left that morning, less than 12 hours before, nothing was left. As I say, thoroughly looted, and 1,500 men, 700 British soldiers, 700 members of the NNC, and 100 colonial troops or civilians had been massacred. But the Zulu victory had come at a heavy price. Over 1,000, well over 1,000 of 𝐁𝐚𝐿's crack troops had died in the gunfire that had been directed at them early on in the battle. And the king himself, 𝐁𝐚𝐿, lamented that an assegai had been plunged into the Zulu nation. Never again would he be able to field an army that strong. As Chelmsford, in the dark, observed the horror around him, a scout approached him. "Sir, I've just been a little way along the track towards Rorke's Drift, and the sky is red with fire." Now, if you remember, Rorke's Drift was a supply depot, and it was a hospital for the No. 3 column. And, you know, I guess you've got to imagine the disappointment of the 90 young soldiers who'd been left there guarding it, when all their comrades had gone off with No. 3 column into Zululand for a battle. So you've come all this way from England for a fight, and you're left guarding a hospital and a supply depot. As I say, 90 men of B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Foot. They were commanded by Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, a partially deaf officer. And, you know, and it said it all. That, you know, Mr. Deafy had been left in charge of a bunch of young men at this godforsaken hole on the border between Natal Colony and Zululand. Unlike the veterans of the 1st Battalion, who had died at Isandlwana that morning, the 2nd Battalion was made up of much younger men. In fact, the average age at Rorke's Drift was 23. And their average height, incidentally, was 5'3". Apart from B Company, guarding the depot, there was a hospital which was under the care of Surgeon Reynolds, and there were 35 sick and injured soldiers in there. There was a small band, small company from the Army Commissariat looking after the supplies, and they were commanded by James Langley Doughton, also an officer. And also on hand was Lieutenant John Chard, a Royal Engineer who had been tasked with building a pontoon bridge across the Buffalo River. As a brevet captain, he actually held seniority. So his little command consisted of 139 soldiers, including the wounded and sick. As the 22nd of January progressed. There were echoes of artillery in the surrounding hills, but and that they could hear them down at the drift, but despite several men climbing the hill that was behind Rorke's drift, they couldn't actually see where the firing was coming from, but it sounded like the battle was starting. So imagine their shock and horror when a breathless colonial officer by the name of Ardendorf galloped in with almost unbelievable news. The camp had fallen. And then he had more news coming from some of Durnford's men who were fleeing. There were 4,000 Zulus on their way to Rorke's Drift now. The officers conferred. What could they do? There was no way that 139 soldiers, including 35 wounded or sick, could outrun 4,000 Zulus on foot. We'd already just seen that at Fugitives Trail. I mean, the Zulus prided themselves on being able to run 20 miles in a day and still fight a battle at the end of it. And anyway, with the hospitalised soldiers, would just slow them down, and they couldn't honestly leave them at the hospital to be massacred by the Zulus while they fled. And moreover, Commissariat Dalton pointed out there were 20,000 rounds of ammunition in the stores at Rorke's Drift. And they couldn't fall into Zulu hands, seeing as the Zulus had just got themselves 1,000 Martini Henry rifles at Isandlwana. So it was decided to stand and fight. Using mealie bags and boxes of army-issue biscuits, they built a wall connecting the hospital and the mission building, and they effectively created a fort. And then they waited. They didn't have to wait long, because at 4:30 a lookout came tearing in from that hill behind, uttering the immortal words, "Here they come, as black as hell and as thick as the grass." The Zulu commander appeared on a white horse, and pouring out behind him came hundreds and hundreds of Zulus. And I wonder what that tiny garrison felt, seeing this and knowing that just a few hours earlier 1,500 men had been overwhelmed by these same Zulus. Actually, they weren't the same Zulus. This was the Zulu reserve. They hadn't been in action at Isandlwana. They'd been held back, and actually they were desperate to get a bit of the action. That's why they'd actually come to Rorke's Drift. And against the king's orders, they had crossed from Zululand into Natal. But the British had three things going for them, which the defenders at Isandlwana, despite their numbers, had not. Firstly, they had 20,000 rounds of ammunition, between just over 100 of them, within a few feet. There was no supply problem here. Secondly, they had a fortified position, and interestingly, 𝐁𝐀 apart from telling his men not to go into Natal, had also said do not fight against a fortified position. But these Zulus, they were up for it, because they wanted a bit of the action too. They weren't going to go home empty-handed and have to tell all their mates they'd sat around while their friends and colleagues had all been out there killing at Isandlwana. And thirdly, their tiny fortified position meant that the Zulus had to attack on a very narrow front. So even though there were 4,000 of them, the Zulus couldn't really couldn't get that numerical advantage to count, as they would have in the open field. For the next 2 hours, the Zulus charged the entrenched British position, until they finally turned their attention to the hospital. And as darkness fell, the Zulus set fire to the thatched roof of the hospital to smoke out the men defending it, and also the sick and wounded that were in there. Now in this is this terrifying scene of smoke, Zulu assegais, collapsing, burning building. The men inside used their bayonets and bare hands to break through the clay walls, interior walls, as they made a fighting withdrawal, room by room. Imagine being in a tiny, dark room, hearing stabbing in the wall, and the wall gives way, and suddenly as you're about to shoot a Zulu, through crawls a red tunic. The nerves of those men must have been as taut as a piano wire. And almost immediately they broke through a wall, the Zulus would enter the room behind them, killing some of the sick patients where they lay. And they actually said, you could obviously the men, it was pitch black, apart from unless they were in a room where there was fire, and they could hear the Zulu assegais going into people and coming out. Maybe they could even smell their enemy in the room, but they didn't know where they were. Just imagine that. And these guys were about 23. I think it's an incredible bravery. You must have just been running on adrenaline, quite frankly. One of the defenders, Henry Hook, who was a cook, And contrary to the film Zulu, he was actually a teetotal model soldier, not an alcoholic barrack room lawyer. He actually was defending, he took an assegai blade across the top of his head. And pictures in later life show that the hair never grew back there. And he suffered from severe headaches for the rest of his life. It took Hook and his comrades 4 hours to dig through 4 walls in that burning hell. And they managed to evacuate 27 of the 35 patients in the hospital. One advantage of the fire had been that it had lit up the Zulus in the pitch black African night. You know, they were almost attacking and the British could see them. But by 11 o'clock, the fire in the hospital had burnt out. And there now followed a series of attacks in the dark. That must have been, well, one of the most, I don't know, how would you describe it? All you could hear was the pounding of feet. And suddenly someone would be onto the barricade and you had to kill them before they killed you. I mean, tired, petrified, running on adrenaline, lips cracked, and so dehydrated they could hardly talk. Shoulders aching from the constant recoil of their rifles. The Henry Martini, the Martini Henry rifle had a powerful recoil. It's like being punched in your shoulder. And the average soldier, it's estimated each soldier probably fired about 200 times that night. Imagine being punched 200 times hard in your shoulder. They were firing so often that Zulus reported, as indeed to some of the British defenders, that the barrels actually glowed red. And because of that, they burnt people's hands. They were stabbing with bayonets. They were dodging assegais coming towards them. How much more could they take? Dalton was pulled out of the line by Chard and was ordered to build a 12-foot final redoubt from mealie bags. This would be the place that the defenders would make their last stand with the Union flag. But it was not needed. At 2:30, the Zulus were exhausted. They had been fighting since 4 o'clock, 4:30 the previous afternoon. They'd been fighting 10 hours. They had run from Ulundi to the 𝐶𝐞 𝐀𝐬𝐴 heights, and then they'd run all the way to Rorke. They hadn't eaten for over 2 days. They were thirsty, and they'd lost over 600 of their comrades here at this mission station for the loss of just 17 British. They'd had enough. As Chelmsford's column retreated back from Isandlwana that morning, they could hardly believe their eyes. They'd seen the smoke from the fire. They knew Rorke was under attack. They could hear the crackle of rifles. And it was only a matter of time before the Zulus overran Rorke. They'd just seen what had happened at Isandlwana. And they couldn't believe their eyes. The scouts, as they came past, the mounted troops, rode up towards the station, scanning for Zulus, and they saw a Union flag flying from the mission station. And as that advance guard approached the defenders opened their mouths to cheer, but they were so parched, no noise could come out. And so the advance guard started to cheer. And back along the column, Chelmsford's column, coming in from Isandlwana, the cheer went up. They realised that Rorke had held out against the most improbable odds. I mean, Rorke is one of the most gallant actions in British military history. That little force held out for over 8, nearly 10 hours, fighting against a force that outnumbered them 40-1. On one respect, they had been really lucky. You know, they built barricades, they had a small perimeter, they had the hospital fire had lit up the attacking Zulus for nearly 5 hours during that battle. They had 20,000 rounds of ammunition right there for them to use, you know, fill your boots. But it was interesting to notice that when they did an inventory check at the end of the battle, of those 20,000 rounds of ammunition, the British had just 650 rounds left at the end of the battle. They'd used up over 19,000 rounds of ammunition. But what it also meant was they only had 650 left. Probably one more determined Zulu assault would have overwhelmed them. They were that close. If you do a little bit of maths, I think you'll find that the 650 rounds would probably have lasted 10-15 minutes at the rate of fire the British had been using them. They were that close. From Rorke being one of the most gallant defences in British military history, to just being another footnote of the Zulu Wars. But history is history is about the events, not the what ifs. They had survived. And let's not for a moment ignore their incredible bravery. Okay, they had guns, but they were outnumbered 40-1. And the British at Isandlwana had only been outnumbered 16-1, and they'd been annihilated. 90 young men, average age 23, first time in action for many of them, had held out. 11 Victoria Crosses and 5 Distinguished Conduct Medals were awarded to the defenders of Rorke's Drift, the highest number of Victoria Crosses ever awarded for a single action in the whole history of the British Army. For those of you who've seen the film Zulu and are stirred by the garrison singing Men of Harlech before the final Zulu charge, well, I've got to pop your bubble, okay? They didn't sing Men of Harlech. They never sang Men of Harlech. In fact, another bubble to pop is of the 139 men at Rorke's Drift, only 27 of them were actually Welsh. But still, great film, not least Michael Caine pretending to be posh as Lieutenant Bromhead. The slow communication that Sir Bartle Frere and Chelmsford had hoped they could use as a cover now usefully delayed the disastrous news of Isandlwana and the gallant defence of Rorke's Drift. It wasn't until just after midnight on the 10th, 11th of February 1879 that the news reached London. And Britain went into an absolute state of shock. How could an imperial force be wiped out by a Zulu army? And the plucky defence of Rorke's Drift was a poor compensation for the magnitude of that defeat at Isandlwana. Whilst playing up the gallantry of the defenders of Rorke's Drift, Chelmsford was also very quick to lay the blame for the defeat at Isandlwana on anybody but himself. And equally, it could not be the fault of any redcoat infantry. So rather than Pauline being held to account for spreading his troops out far too widely, they were over half a mile from the camp, 3 myths were planted as to what had happened to explain that loss at Isandlwana. Firstly, the Natal native contingent collapsed at a crucial moment. Secondly, Anthony Durnford had ridden out and left the camp when he should have been taking command, and had ridden out for a bit of glory. And finally, the commissariat delayed the ammunition supply. There's this myth from Isandlwana that the ammunition, the quartermasters were being very pedantic about exactly who could have ammunition from which wagon, and they would send people to another wagon, and also they didn't have enough screwdrivers to open up the boxes. Not only do these myths obscure Chelmsford's culpability in dividing his force and Pauline's decision to spread his line too thinly and not create any sort of entrenched position at Isandlwana, and we see how it worked at Rorke's Drift, it ignores something far more important. That the British had been outmanoeuvred and outfought by an enemy with spears and shields. The Zulus had successfully fooled Chelmsford into dividing his force. They had moved 25,000 men undetected to the north of the camp. And then they delivered the horns of the buffalo attack over a 3-mile front with no modern form of communication. And despite one of those horns actually going behind the mountain, they timed it perfectly to encircle the British camp and deliver the devastating attack. And finally, despite the withering fire laid down by those experienced British redcoats, the Zulu warriors had held their nerve, taken a punishing fire, and had then pressed home the attack to the finish. But there was no way the Victorians, the Queen, the government, and most of all the army were going to admit to that the British army had been outclassed by a native army. And hence that need to find scapegoats to provide a narrative that the British had lost the battle rather than the Zulus winning it. The shocking defeat did have one silver lining to Chelmsford and Sir Bartle Frere's cloud, which was that Isandlwana had been such a disaster, a national humiliation, that the government now found troops to restore Britannia's honour. And with this new, stronger army made up of British regular forces, not local forces and NNC, Chelmsford re-invaded Zululand. And on the 4th of July, 1879, less than 6 months after Isandlwana, he delivered the final fatal, devastating defeat on the Zulu army outside their capital of Ulundi. King 𝐀𝐀 was captured. He was actually brought to London, where he met Queen Victoria. London society were fascinated to meet 𝐀𝐀. He was like a celebrity, but his kingdom was no more. And on the fields of Zululand lay over 7,000 warriors who died defending their homeland and the old Zulu order. The Zulu wars are from a different age. In fact, it's really interesting. They fade very quickly from memory, actually, mainly because the Victorians had loads more wars they could talk about. There was Gordon in Khartoum, and there was the First Boer War, the Second Boer War, then we moved into the First and Second World Wars. And it wasn't until 1960s, with the release of the film Zulu, and with the publication of Washing of the Spears, which went on to sell 200,000 copies, that people suddenly started to remember the Zulu War and our current fascination with the Zulu War, which continues to this day, sort of was reinvigorated. The defenders of Rorke's Drift also faded from view. Henry Hook, VC, with the hairline that never grew back because of his assegai, couldn't find employment when he left the army, and eventually the War Office had to step in and get him a job as a janitor at the British Museum. Another one of the Victoria Cross winners, a man called William Jones, VC, was one of many people who carried the nightmare of that nighttime attack with him for the rest of his life. And in later years in Manchester, he would grab his grandchildren and run from the house screaming the Zulus were coming after them. And in an age when post-traumatic stress disorder was not recognised, he received no help. He actually had to pawn his Victoria Cross in the 1890s. And when he died in 1913, he was buried in a pauper's grave. Whilst the Zulu War in many respects is far away from now, maybe the way we care for some of our veterans hasn't changed that much. As Kipling wrote, "It's Tommy this, and Tommy that, and Tommy go away. But it's thank you, Mr. Adkins, when the bands begin to play." Thanks for joining me, and if you haven't before, sign up at thehistorychap.com to hear more of my talks.